History of Scotland, Part 2, The First Farmers. Starting at the end of the last Ice Age, around 11,500 BC, something started changing far to the east of Scotland. In the hills of southern Turkey, at a place we now call Göbekli Tepe, hundreds of men were dragging enormous blocks of quarried stone. Quite what inspired them to take this radical departure from their hunter-gatherer lifestyle we do not know. All that we can see is the result. Giant stone circles, not plain like those of Britain thousands of years later, but instead adorned with elaborate carvings of what we can only assume to be their ancient gods, most of which are beings of part animal and part human composition, or simply carvings of the native animals of that region, such as wild boar. These are not small carvings either, some of them being up to 20 feet tall and weighing many tons. For most of the study of human history, it was assumed that agriculture and sedentary living came before religion, but the people of Göbekli Tepe were nomadic hunter-gatherers, like anyone else in the world at the time. From the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, it seems that the reality was the other way round, with hunter-gatherers building great religious sites before farming was ever a thought. Nearby, in a place called Mesopotamia, in the southeast of modern-day Iraq, people began to step back from hunting with the domestication of the pig and sowing their own grains that could later be harvested and turned into either a basic porridge, baked into bread, or perhaps brewed into a primitive beer. This new way of living provided far more food for the same area of land, and provided some protection against cataclysm, with the ability to store food for bad years. It also meant that for the first time, not everyone needed to work producing food, freeing some people up for specialty occupations that either would not have existed or would have been confined to the aged or otherwise physically disabled in hunter-gatherer communities. However, there were drawbacks. Farmers had diets that were far less varied than hunter-gatherers, and as such were smaller, weaker, and more malnourished than their hunter-gatherer counterparts. And if there ever was a crop failure, long enough that the food stores ran out, they could not simply move to a different food source, as they were too numerous. Before too long, even meat, that was a staple of human diet in all of previous prehistory, became rare outside of the diets of high-status individuals, and may have at times disappeared from the diets of common people entirely. But despite this, with the new relative abundance of food, the population of these farming regions of Mesopotamia began to grow exponentially. With farming also came ownership. In hunter-gatherer societies, there are few things that need to be owned, and even fewer that matter. An individual might have some clothes and some jewellery that they wear, and weaponry that they hunt with, but land was not something to be owned. Neither were the homes they built, and neither were people. With farming, all of this changed. Lordship over land was developed, as were the first forms of home ownership, and unfortunately, with back-breaking repetitive labour, also came the first slavery. But with ownership comes a problem. When the resources are limited and the population is growing. When a property owner dies, it must be decided what happens to their property. And the solution that these people in Iraq seem to have adopted is the most common solution through human history. That being patrilocal primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits the property and the daughters marry and move away from home. This creates a problem where now the second sons suffer from a huge blow to their social standing and prestige, as well as their marriage prospects when the father dies. Sure, there may be enough food, at least for a while, But food is not the only thing that humans crave. And so these second sons began gathering all the followers they could and forcing the surrounding hunter-gatherers that existed on the fringes of these farming societies from their land, and using these formerly wild areas for farming. And then the cycle would continue, with these farmers themselves settling down and causing the same problems for their children. At first, the hunter-gatherers likely offered little resistance, but later, as more and more of the land was taken, they faced a choice: assimilate to the newcomers, or try to resist their far greater numbers. Inevitably, at times, the gatherers did resist. These bigger and stronger men, who had far more experience with the weapons that they used daily for hunting. But as far as we can tell, the farmers always won in the end. Over thousands of years, this slow migration of the second sons spread through the Middle East and into Europe in two huge slow waves. One moving through the fertile plains of North Africa and into Spain, and the other moving west through the Balkans to Germany and Italy. It was in central France that these two groups that had been separated for thousands of years finally met. For the people of Scotland, in 4600 BC, they've probably first realised the world was changing when strange animals began making their way through the trade networks. Prior to this, the only domesticated animals present in Scotland were the dogs that were domesticated with the spread of humans in the last ice age. But now, in settlements across the British Isles, cow bones start to be found. Animals likely traded or gifted from settled farming people in modern-day Normandy. As the Neolithic or New Stone Age continued, these farming people continued what they had always done, and began a slow migration into the British Isles, with the first arriving not long before 4000 BC, and moving around the coasts. We do not know for certain if the hunter-gatherers of pre-agricultural societies resisted these newcomers or assimilated to each other. But the British Isles has always been a bastion of old peoples, due to the relative protection of the English Channel and the hostile landscape of the north and west of the Isle of Britain. We see this reflected in the modern-day genetic makeup of Scots, with more than 20% of the Scottish genome coming from these ancient hunter-gatherers, far more than in England or France. Evidence that this was likely more a peaceful merger than a violent conflict can be seen at a number of religious sites built by the farmers, where there is evidence that these were initially important sites of the hunter-gatherers. These new farming people lived a sedentary life, where they lived on mostly grain that they farmed and milk from the cows that they raised, the cows being rarely used for meat on account of their utility. As the hunter-gatherers had done before, they likely supplemented their diet from the natural world, while still hunting, fishing and gathering what natural foods they could, at least for a while. But with the vastly increased population, this made up a far smaller percentage of their diet than it did for those who lived before farming. In much of the mainland of Scotland, east and south of the Highlands, these new farmers built a culture with communal longhouses capable of holding many families under a single roof, in a fashion similar to the Vikings 5,000 years later. These people were largely pastoralists, focusing mostly on the raising of domesticated animals, and likely lived a lifestyle similar to those people who today live a traditional lifestyle focused around cows in places such as East Africa. It is likely that cow milk and possibly cow blood, gathered carefully so as not to hurt the animal, were a highly significant part of their diet. The most clear settlements from this time, however, come from the Northern Isles, particularly Orkney, which seems to have been a highly important regional centre, a status that it would maintain for thousands of years to come. Though it is important to remember The often good evidence of the Neolithic period is only found in remote areas due to the lack of ploughing and building over the old settlements. The oldest settlement so far found in Orkney is known as the Nap of Her, and consists of 2 large stone houses surrounded in earth and discarded rubbish to hold in the heat produced by the large internal fireplace. Each of these houses may have held a large extended family group. These people raised a number of domesticated animals, but particularly cattle, pigs and early sheep, while also cultivating wheat and barley that they turned into bread and beer. These people also continued some old hunter-gatherer habits, such as fishing and the gathering of shellfish. These practices are largely continued in the later village of Skara Brae, on the Isle of Mainland, where many well-built stone houses have been discovered, each one of which would likely have held a family. That village was inhabited for over 600 years, with new houses being built upon the foundations of the old, showing a remarkable continuation of habitation over countless generations. It is in this period too where we first see evidence of large, consistent trade networks that would have had a significant influence on the day-to-day life of the people of Neolithic Scotland. Artefacts and the first pottery made in Scotland, both clearly originating from Orkney, are found all over the north and west of Scotland. In this time, regular people could expect to own many items, from jewellery to household utensils, that would have been made relatively far away and transported likely via maritime trade routes. Indeed, in this time it is clear that there were links, cultural, religious and economic, across not only Scotland, but across the British Isles, with Scotland and particularly the Northern Isles at the heart. But this was far from all positive. As was always the case, the second sun problem rose again. For thousands of years, the Great Caledonian Forest had provided a great natural bounty for the people of Scotland. But as the demand for timber and farmland grew, these Neolithic people took up their stone axes and began the deforestation of Scotland. From 4000 to 2000 BC, what was once a great temperate rainforest was almost all cleared, with only a few patches of old-growth forest still present today. This was not even of particular benefit to those who deforested the landscape. As with all rainforests, the soil is of poor quality and unsuited to anything but the grazing of herd animals, a practice that requires a much greater area to maintain the same number of people. What little arable farming there has always been in the Highlands is a hard and laborious process, traditionally referred to in Scotland as bastard farming on account of its difficulty. In the next chapter, we will examine how these people developed and produced many of the monuments that mark our landscape to this very day.